Hey there, it's Stephen. I've always loved Christmas, the lights, the cozy nights, the feeling that, just for a little while, the world feels a bit brighter. But sometimes, it's not all warmth and cheer. Sometimes, Christmas has a way of showing us something darker. Tonight, I've got 3 stories that will make you rethink everything about this season. Stories that left me with chills, stories that make you wonder, what if those cozy nights aren't as safe as they seem? These stories are the kind that stick with you, the ones that creep into your thoughts when the house is quiet and the shadows feel a little too long. So grab a blanket, make sure the lights are on, and settle in. Because tonight, we're diving into the kind of Christmas you'll never forget, no matter how much you try. Story 1. Imagine sitting by the fire, the tree twinkling softly in the corner, when you hear a whisper, a voice you know all too well, calling your name. But there's no one there. That's the kind of night it was for the Sanders family. It was Christmas Eve, the most magical night of the year. The Sanders family was gathered in the living room of their cozy home, the faint scent of pine and cinnamon filling the air. The tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling in a soft glow. Ornaments hung from its branches, some old, some new, each with a story. John and Sarah Sanders watched their children, Lucy and Ben, run around the room, laughing as they admired the gifts under the tree. The fireplace crackled, and everything felt perfect. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to settle over the house, one that none of them could explain. It started with small things. At first, it was just the flickering of the tree lights. No one thought much of it. The old electrical wiring in their house had always caused a bit of trouble. But then, as the night grew deeper, things became more unsettling. The ornaments began to shift slightly as if an unseen hand was brushing against them. Sarah, who was sitting on the couch with her knitting, felt a chill run down her spine when she looked over at the tree. The branches trembled, just enough for her to notice, but she quickly dismissed it. The wind outside was howling, after all. Surely that's all it was. But then came the whisper. At first, it was so faint Sarah thought it might have been the wind again. Sarah, it was her name, unmistakable. She spun around, but there was no one there. Lucy and Ben were too busy playing, and John was in the kitchen, preparing the last of the snack. She was alone in the room, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Sarah tried to brush it off as a trick of the mind, but as the evening wore on, she began to feel something else, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. It was as if the house itself was alive, observing her every move. Her eyes kept darting to the tree. The whispers grew louder, this time more distinct. "Help me," it was soft, almost pleading. "John?" Sarah called out, her voice shaky. John appeared in the doorway, his face tight with concern. "What's wrong?" "I heard something. A voice. It called my name." John smiled, his face warm with the comfort of the holiday. "You've been working hard all day. I think you need some rest. It's just the wind, Sarah. Nothing more." But Sarah wasn't convinced. As John returned to the kitchen, she got up from the couch and slowly walked toward the tree. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached. The tree, which had once felt so comforting, now seemed to loom over her like a silent sentinel. She reached out to touch a branch, and her fingers brushed against something cold, something wrong. She recoiled, but the tree stood still, as if daring her to touch it again. Just then, Lucy and Ben ran past her, giggling as they chased each other around the living room. Sarah turned to watch them, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something shift in the shadows of the tree. She blinked and looked again. Nothing. It was probably just her tired eyes playing tricks. That night, as the family gathered around the tree to exchange gifts, Sarah's unease only deepened. The tree seemed to pulse with energy, its lights flickering more than usual. John smiled at her, trying to reassure her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When everyone had finally settled into bed, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet now, except for the distant crackle of the fireplace. But the silence was broken when she heard the whisper again. "Sarah," it called. Her blood ran cold. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. She wasn't imagining this. The voice was real. She threw off the covers and rushed down the stairs, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floors. The living room was empty, save for the tree. It was silent, too silent. The warmth from the fire had dimmed, leaving the room cold and eerie. The tree, it was moving. The branches shifted slightly, as if something was inside it, twisting and turning. Sarah's breath hitched in her chest as the tree seemed to grow taller, its branches creeping toward her like hands reaching out of the darkness. She took a step back, but before she could run, the tree's lights exploded, casting eerie shadows across the room. The room seemed to shrink around her as the temperature plummeted. The tree groaned, a low, mournful sound as if it was alive. Then, the door to the hallway creaked open. Standing there was a figure, pale, gaunt, and dressed in tattered clothes. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his skull, and his face was twisted in agony. "Help me," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping breath. Sarah froze, her heart racing as she recognized the face. It was Thomas, John's brother, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago. But this wasn't Thomas. This was something else, something dark and twisted that had taken his form. The figure stepped forward, its feet dragging across the floor as it approached her. "Finish it," it whispered. "The war, it never ends." Suddenly, the tree began to pulse again, its branches lashing out, grabbing Sarah by the arms. She screamed as the tree's cold grip tightened, pulling her toward its trunk. "Sarah!" John's voice echoed through the room as he rushed to her side. But it was too late. The tree groaned and creaked, its branches entangling around Sarah's body. As the last of her breath escaped her lungs, the figure behind her smiled, a dark, knowing grin. When John and the children rushed into the room, it was empty. The tree stood still, its lights twinkling, but Sarah was gone. The whispers ceased. The house was silent. And the Sanders family would never again celebrate Christmas in that home. Imagine waking up on Christmas morning, thinking you're going to have a peaceful day of unwrapping presents and enjoying breakfast with your family. But what if the Christmas spirit is something much darker, something that comes to claim what's its own? Tonight, this is the story of the ghost who visits every Christmas, and how no one who's ever received its gift has lived to tell about it. It was Christmas Eve in the small town of Hawthorne Hill, nestled in the shadow of the thick forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The town was quiet, the streets covered in a blanket of freshly fallen snow, the twinkling lights of homes reflecting off the icy surfaces. The Anderson family, Megan, her husband Kyle, and their 2 children, Emma and Luke, had spent the day decorating the tree and preparing for the festivities that would come with Christmas morning. There was a warmth in the house, a comforting glow that made it feel like the world outside had disappeared. But there was something old about this house. Megan's family had lived in this town for generations, and the house they now occupied had been passed down through the years. There were always stories, the kind of stories people whispered but never dared speak about too loudly. People said the house was haunted, but Megan had never believed in ghosts. Not until that night. They had just finished their Christmas Eve dinner, sitting by the fire when Kyle's voice broke the silence. "Did you hear that?" Megan glanced up from the fire, confused. "Hear what?" Kyle stood up from the couch, his eyes narrowing. It sounded like a bell, like a small, soft jingle. "You hear it, right?" Megan frowned. The house was still, aside from the soft crackle of the fire. The wind outside howled through the trees, but nothing else moved. "It's probably just the wind, Kyle." But then, a sound echoed again, a faint, tinkling jingle, almost like a bell ringing from far off. Luke, who had been playing with his toy soldiers, suddenly stopped and looked up with wide eyes. "Mom, there's someone at the door." Megan walked to the front door, thinking it was a late-night visitor or perhaps a neighbor stopping by with a Christmas gift. But when she opened the door, no one was there. The air was cold, a sharp wind cutting through her thin sweater. She looked around, but the yard was empty. The house, shrouded in darkness, looked abandoned and cold under the moonlight. Confused, she closed the door, the jingling sound fading away. "There's no one out there, Luke. It's probably just the wind." But before she could turn around, a voice, soft, almost a whisper, came from behind her. "You've been naughty." She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. Kyle, Emma, and Luke were sitting by the fire, staring at her as though nothing had happened. Megan's breath came faster, a chill creeping up her spine. She tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered. The voice, it had been so clear, so close. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flared up, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The windows rattled in their frames, and the bells rang again, this time louder, closer. The air grew colder, and Megan's skin prickled with unease. The jingle was followed by a soft thud, like footsteps coming from the attic above. Megan's heart pounded in her chest. "Kyle, check the attic," she whispered, but her husband didn't move. He seemed rooted to his chair, his eyes vacant, staring at the fire with an odd expression on his face. "Kyle?" Megan asked again, her voice shaky. He didn't respond. His lips parted, but no words came out. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, knuckles white. Emma and Luke looked at him, their faces blank, eerily calm. Megan's fear grew. Something was terribly wrong. She glanced up at the attic door, which was slightly ajar, its darkened interior yawning at her like the mouth of a cave. Slowly, she reached for the door handle, but before she could touch it, the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps echoed from above. The floorboards creaked in protest as something moved slowly across them. Without thinking, Megan grabbed the closest thing she could, a fireplace poker, and crept toward the stairs. She could hear the unmistakable sound of a bell ringing again, now frantically, as if something, or someone, was approaching the top of the stairs. Her pulse raced, but she forced herself to move forward. With a trembling hand, she pushed the attic door open, only to find nothing but darkness. The room was cold, colder than it should have been. The walls were covered in cobwebs, and dust hung in the air, untouched by the warmth of the house. Then, the lights flickered, and in the far corner of the room, a shadowy figure appeared. It was tall and thin, cloaked in something that shimmered, like a dark, tattered robe. A bell, small and delicate, hung from the figure's wrist, and as it raised its head, Megan's heart stopped. The figure had no face, only a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. And yet, she could feel its gaze on her, piercing through her soul. The shadow stretched as it stepped toward her, dragging its feet across the floor with a sound that made her blood run cold. "You've been naughty," the figure whispered, its voice echoing in the darkness. Megan tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt her body freeze in place as the figure reached out to touch her arm, its skin cold as ice. "You didn't listen," it murmured. "Now you will pay." With a swift movement, the figure wrapped its fingers around her wrist, its grip tightening with a force that made her bones ache. The bells jingled louder, and Megan's vision blurred as the air grew heavier, suffocating. She tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't obey. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared. The attic was empty again, the door slammed shut behind her, and the warmth of the house returned, leaving her breathless and trembling. She stumbled back down the stairs, her heart still racing. But when she reached the living room, she found that everything had changed. Kyle, Emma, and Luke were standing in front of the fire, their faces expressionless. They weren't moving. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the flames as though they were watching something only they could see. Suddenly, Megan heard the jingle again, faint and distant. It grew louder, and she turned around to see the figure standing in the doorway. This time, it wasn't empty-handed. In its grasp was a gift, wrapped in dark, tattered paper. The bell jingled louder, and as it approached, Megan felt a chill creep down her spine. "You've been naughty," the figure said again, its voice soft but cruel. It held out the gift. "For you." But there was no joy in the gift. No warmth. No Christmas spirit. The figure extended its arm, and Megan, trembling, reached for it. As soon as her fingers brushed the gift, a sharp pain coursed through her, and the room spun. She dropped to her knees, gasping for breath. The figure tilted its head, its blank face watching her. "You will never forget this Christmas?" With one final jingle of the bells, the figure vanished, and the house fell silent. The next morning, when the sun rose and the family gathered around the Christmas tree, they found nothing but empty stockings and unwrapped gift. There were no signs of the dark visitor. No bell, no shadow, no ghostly figure. But they all knew. Christmas had claimed its gift, and it would return. For the Anderson family, there would be no more Christmases in peace. Some Christmas gifts are never meant to be opened. What would you do if the gift under the tree was meant for someone else? And what if you opened it, only to realize that something was waiting inside for you? This is a story about a Christmas gift that no one should ever have received. It was Christmas Eve when Mark, his wife Clara, and their young daughter Sophie gathered around the tree, the house aglow with twinkling lights and the smell of cinnamon and pine filling the air. It had been a tough year, one marked by loss, but Christmas had always been a time for family, and they were determined to make it joyful. The last few presents sat beneath the tree, waiting to be opened. "We saved the best for last," Clara said with a grin, holding up a large, ornate box wrapped in deep red paper with gold ribbons. "I think this is from your mom," she added, nudging Mark playfully. Mark stared at the box, confused. His mom had passed away several months ago, and this gift had arrived just that morning, no return address, no note. Clara had assumed it was from a relative, but Mark felt uneasy. Something about it didn't feel right. Who would send something this big with no card? Mark murmured. But Clara was already lifting the lid, eager to see what was inside. Sophie leaned in, her small hands touching the edge of the box with excitement. As Clara peeled back the wrapping, the strange feeling in Mark's gut grew stronger. Inside the box was a simple wooden box, much smaller, with intricate carvings of swirling vines and leaves etched into the surface. It didn't look particularly valuable, but there was something eerie about it. The wood had a strange, almost unnatural sheen to it. Clara lifted the small box from the larger one, and as she did, the air in the room seemed to grow heavier, colder. "Maybe it's something old," she said, brushing her fingers over the carvings. "A family heirloom?" Before Mark could respond, Clara opened the box, and immediately, a low, unnatural sound echoed through the room. It was a deep, unsettling hum, like the sound of something ancient stirring awake. Mark's heart raced as a thick, dark mist began to billow out of the box. It was not like smoke, but more like fog, swirling and twisting, darkening the space around them. Sophie screamed and stumbled backward, her small hands reaching out for her mother. Clara gasped and dropped the box, but it was too late. The mist began to take form, growing larger and denser by the second. Mark stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Clara, close the box," he shouted, but the box seemed to have a life of its own, opening wider, as if it were pulling them in. The mist took on a shape, humanoid, shadowy, and cloaked in the same dark fog. Mark could barely make out the figure's face, but it was there, eyes glowing faintly, a twisted, hollow mouth that seemed to stretch wider as it moved. Sophie's voice, small and terrified, whispered from behind them. "Daddy, who's that?" Mark turned, and his blood ran cold. There, standing by the door, was a figure, a man in tattered, ancient clothing. His eyes were empty, hollow sockets that seemed to suck in the light around him. He held a long, thin, black staff, and his presence chilled the room as though winter had come alive. The man didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at them with eyes that burned with an unnatural hunger. Mark wanted to run, but his body refused to obey. It was as if the figure's gaze had frozen him in place. Clara, her face pale, took Sophie's hand and backed toward the far corner, whispering for them to stay quiet, to stay out of its reach. The man stepped forward, and the air turned even colder. The flames in the fireplace flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness, only the pale glow from the mist and the figure lighting the space. Mark's breath came in shallow gasps as the figure's gaze turned to him. "This gift," the figure whispered, his voice like the crackling of dry leaves, "was never meant for you." Mark's heart pounded. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who are you?" The figure lifted the staff and pointed it at the box. The mist churned violently, then began to fold back into the box, as if the man was commanding it. It was then Mark realized that the box wasn't just any gift, it was a prison, a containment. Something or someone had been trapped inside. This gift was never for your family. It was for a soul much older, one that has waited for too long, the figure hissed, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Mark. A sudden realization hit him. The figure, the mist, the cold, everything made sense. The gift wasn't meant for him or his family. It was a mistake, an ancient mistake that they were now caught in. He had opened a doorway that allowed the soul of an ancient, vengeful spirit to reach out and claim what was never meant to be free. The figure raised his staff high, and the temperature dropped even further, the walls growing darker, the shadows closing in on the family. Mark had no choice. His hand shot out and slammed the wooden box shut, but it was too late. The figure lunged, its form dissipating into smoke, and the room shook violently. The family was thrown back, hitting the walls and the floor with a crash. When Mark regained his senses, the figure was gone. The room was back to normal. The fireplace crackled, the mist had disappeared, and the box, the cursed gift, was now closed, but the damage had already been done. Mark held Clara and Sophie, trembling. The world outside seemed unchanged, but Mark knew something darker had entered their lives, something that wouldn't let them go. From that night on, no matter how far they moved, no matter how many Christmases came and went, they would always hear the faint, soft ringing of a bell, deep in the distance, a reminder that some gifts should never be opened, and that some spirits could never be forgotten.